Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Herman Pontzer. He is professor of evolutionary anthropology and global health at the Global Health Institute at Duke University. And today we're talking about his book, Adaptable: How Your Unique Body Really Works and Why Our Biology Unites Us. So, Dr. Pontzer, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, in the book, you talk a lot about biological diversity, specifically in humans and where it stems from. So, tell us first about that. Where does biological diversity in humans stem from, and why do you think it is important to consider it?
Yeah, so, it's the standard nature and nurture story, but I think it's one that we don't tell in the right way. And we kind of, sort of don't do it well. And so, the reason that we're all unique biologically is that, first of all, we've all got our own unique set of genes. So there are about 20,000 protein coding genes, and there's a lot of thousands of others that turn those genes on and off. And, in any population, there might be 4 or 5 versions of each of those, 20, 30,000 genes. Yeah. And so the chance that you have exactly the same set of variants that I do is basically zero, unless we're identical twins. And then even if we were identical twins, that's where the nurture comes in, the environment comes in. As we grow up and grow old, our life, actually turns on and off some of those genes. So they don't all express the same way. Our bodies, even if we had the same kind of genetic pathways activated, we're built to learn and we're built to adapt to our environments as we grow up. And so, very quickly after birth, even 2 identical twins would have, slightly different biologies. And by the time they're 4 or 5 years old, it's significant. So the genetics and the environment, no 2 sets are alike. And that ends up making us biologically unique.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you about twins and twin studies later in our conversation. Sure. But I mean, how much, because when we talk about biological variation in humans, many times people immediately bring to the table variation between human populations. So how much biological variation is there really between any 2 human populations? Is there really a lot of variation or not?
There's some, but in every case, the difference is smaller between the averages than it is between any 2 people. And so one thing that we teach a lot in in anthropology is that something like 90% plus of the genetic variation that we see across the human species is within groups, right? And the other 10% is sort of between groups. And so if you think about these sort of bell-shaped distributions of genetics, you can think about it that way as kind of a heuristic. The means can be a little bit different, but there's so much overlap, right, that if I pick 2 individuals from any one group, I'm just as likely to get as much genetic difference as I am the difference between averages of between 2 groups.
Yeah. So with that in mind, and of course I have to address this issue because you're very well aware that even nowadays people use these terms and there are people who still do or try to do race science. So
I know. Yeah.
Is race a good enough proxy for biological diversity? I mean, is it even a scientific concept?
Yeah, it's terrible, right? I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that the way that we think about genetic diversity or biological diversity in the US anyway, and I think this is becoming more and more global, is we think about it in terms of race categories, right? That somehow, if I know that, in America, it's Black, white, Hispanic, we have these blocks of racial categories. They're basically useless, right? Now, people say, well, but the skin color is different, right? Between your Black and white people, for example. Well, that's true. In that one trait, you can see differences on average between groups. Not always, by the way, but you can see differences in like one trait or another trait. That doesn't mean that genetically these whole groups are different or that they're even coherent groups, right? So there's so much variation within what we call in the United States, what we would call white and what we would call Black, that it's a meaningless category. It has no edges biologically that make any sense. It's a socially constructed category. And so, right, the way that we talk about variation biologically is just nonsensical in the US. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to get this book out there.
Yeah. One very interesting thing that you talk about in the book that I was sort of not expecting it, and it's interesting because it also ties to some very current political issues in the US, actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, during intrauterine development, when does life start exactly? I mean, from the moment of fertilization, when exactly in our intrauterine development can we say that life has started?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked the question. You know, as I wrote this book, I wanted people to understand how our bodies work, and that's the foundation of how we get to biological variation and all these big topics. And I formatted the book the way that I would teach this class. You know, we would take, if we want to understand the human body, we'd start at the very beginning, we'd work our way all the way through. And as I was writing these chapters, I realized, okay, we're not going to be able to talk about the body and then talk about the politics. We're going to have to talk about the politics every chapter, because everything, you know, whether it's brains, whether it's immune systems, whether it's the heart, whether it's digestive, whether it's embryology, every piece of our body carries a socio-political debate right now. I don't know if it was always been that way, but it certainly is these days. And so the embryology story, I think, is a great way to start. In the US anyway, there's a lot of debate and conflict about, you know, this idea of when does life begin? Does it begin at the fertilization of an egg? Does it begin later? And, you know, one of the points I make in the book is there's really not, we talk about it as when does life begin? That doesn't get it quite right, because life is some billions of years old on this planet. Each of us, every animal, every organism alive today is a part of that unbroken chain of life that's billions of years old. So when does life begin? Well, you're a little bit late, because life started billions of years ago. Yeah. But of course, that's not what people are really asking. What people are really asking is, when does this clump of cells become a person, right? And then that's a much more complicated question, because that's no longer a biology question, right? That's, if we ask what's a person, then that's an ethical, religious, political question. And those are important, but to talk about it as though it's a clean-cut biology question is actually not right. Now we can get to the question of when do you become a person, right? Well, okay, if, for example, we want to say that you are a person as soon as the egg is fertilized, well, that's interesting, because the egg by that point is already as old as mom is, because eggs form in her embryology, right, when she was in utero, and the sperm is much more young. So is that individual as old as mom, or is it as old as that moment when the fertilization happens? If personhood happens at fertilization, and we start then and go to clock forward, then when does personhood, does that fertilized egg two people, if somehow in the future it's going to become twins, right? Right. What happens when we have two fertilized eggs that join together? That happens sometimes. It's called chimerism. Are those two people that become one person, right? If that embryo, as it develops, if you develop it as a sort of a tube, and then your head ends up on one end of the tube, your other end of you ends up on the other side of the tube. A funny thing could happen if it splits at the head end and you end up with two heads, right? But just one body, we would call that two people. We call it conjoined twins. If it happens the other way and you got two sets of legs and one head, we'd call that one person with two. So, you know, it's no clean-cut answer would really work, but I think what we begin to understand is what we're really talking about is heads, right? A functioning brain that can give you a functioning personality and mind. Okay, and I think that's clarifying then, because we're not talking about some clump of cells. We're actually talking about the ability to do what you and I are doing at some level, which is to communicate.
Okay, and when exactly would that be in intrauterine development? I mean, what week are we talking about?
We're talking, well, it's a fuzzy, it's not a it's here one day and it's not, it's not here today and it's there tomorrow. It's the brain development is continuous. But in terms of the electrical activity in the brain that we can measure that we think means your brain's awake and moving, that doesn't really happen until, somewhere in the 20 to 30th week is when we begin to see activity that you might say, okay, that has the kind of activity that we associate with, at least minimal function of a human brain. And so that happens to be, by the way, around the same time that, a fetus would be viable if it's prematurely born, for example, in the 25th, 26th week. That's really early. It's still quite difficult to manage and dangerous for the child. But, that's around the time that you've got viability. And so that kind of begins to align with one common way we think about this is whenever the fetus would be viable and could survive on its own outside of the womb, maybe that's when we want to call it, that when we'll start it then. And that would sort of line up with the brain version. But, again, to pretend there's a sort of very clean, easy biology answer is not right.
Okay, so let me ask you now about height, because I think that this is a trait that we can also use as an illustrative example to understand better how we should think about variation among people and populations. So where does the variation in terms of height that we see among people and populations stem from?
Yeah, I mean, height is the perfect example of these, what we call complex traits. Most traits are what we would call complex traits. What a biologist means by that is there's dozens or hundreds or even thousands of genes, each of which contributes a little bit, right? We all know probably that, if you have tall parents, you're likely to have tall kids. Or you have short parents, they'll probably have short kids, right? So we intuitively understand there's some, genes that are passed down. Well, it turns out it's not one or two genes that affect your height. It's literally thousands, maybe over 10,000 genes. And each contributes a tiny little bit, right? So the gene variants that you got from mom and the ones you got from dad, that's the hand you're dealt. You put those together, and that's what your sort of genetic possibility is, your genetic potential is. But then, because this is, again, the classic complex trait, you've got all of your childhood development that's going to affect your height as well. So nutrition is the big one. But as a piece of that, if you're sick a lot as a kid and your body is spending energy fighting infections and can't spend it on growth, for example, those lead to differences there. But, think about what that gives us, right? If we have, look at a population of people, right? The folks that you grew up with, right? You probably know short folks and tall people, right? And by the way, it's not just height, right? All of our body shape, it functions this way. So face shape is the same way, hand shape, all of the growth that gives you your form plays by the same rules. So height's the obvious, easy one to measure, but all of it would be that way. Growing up, the people in your population some are tall, some are short, whatever. There are average differences between populations, but that's a much smaller difference. The average height of people in France versus the average height of people in, I don't know, Kenya. There's some difference there, I'm sure, on average, but the variation is much bigger between any two individuals than between the means. And then you get some interesting cases where you do have local adaptation, where populations that I've been able to work in, for example, it's incredibly hot and dry. You're living in northern Kenya, where there's hardly any rain. It's so hot on the equator. And there's been selection over time to favor gene variants that get you a bit taller and a bit thinner. But that's very localized, right? And it's not all Africans, for example, even though that is an African population. It's population specific. And so you do kind of have these population variations in heights and weights on average. But those are sort of the small whispers of selection, usually across the sort of global variation.
So tell us more about those local adaptations, because I imagine that another good example of that people many times notice has to do with nose shape, for example. I mean, some populations or people who are descendants of some African populations tend to have a wider
Yeah.
nose than other people. People who are mostly of uh, who have a white skin, let's say. Of course, this is just proxies that I'm using, but
Yeah.
anyway, I mean, what explains that sort of variation? For
Yeah.
example,
So
a nose shape and the shape of the head, for example, and other facial traits.
yeah, there's great science on this. So people have sort of mapped the face of, tens of thousands of people around the globe and then try to relate that to genetics.
Yeah.
And the story is mostly noise. And so, if you have like a wide head versus a long head, if you have high cheekbones, low cheek, whatever, the shape of the eyes, as far as we can tell, there are interesting local variations in that. We all know. My wife, her family is from China, so you don't have to guess. She's Asian if you look at her, right? We humans are very good at noticing patterns. And so, I'm not going to sort of gaslight everybody and say that that's not real. You can say, oh, that person looks like they're from Asian descent. That person looks like they're from African descent. And that's because of these variations in shape and size, often of facial features, etc.
Yeah.
Most of that variation, again, is just noise. So, if you think about, think about a big bowl of M&Ms, right? You mix it all up. So it's totally mixed. Those are your gene variants around the globe. The M&Ms is your global human variation of genes. But if I were to pick up one scoop, I'm probably not going to get the perfect mix. I'm probably going to get a clump of oranges and reds, or I'll get a clump of whatever, right?
Yeah.
So most variation in our shape, our face shape, head shape, that kind of stuff, is just a sort of local clumping for reasons that just seem to be random and not meaningful, functionally meaningful around the globe. Nose shape is an interesting example of a contrary example of that. You can do nice statistical tests when people map the face and then correlate to the genes. You can test if there's selection, if there's been adaptation, and nose shape seems to be one of these adaptation stories. You see big, narrow nostril noses in cold, dry climates. And it seems like we know that a big nose helps you humidify the air, and also helps you lose less humidity when you breathe air out. So it seems like it's that story. A wider nose is not just an African adaptation. It's actually, if you look around the globe, it's places where the air is warm and humid. And that seems to be selected there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Face, head shape, that seems like it's noise. Skin color, that's adaptation, right? That seems to be an adaptation to how much sunlight you get. If you get a lot, then darker skin. That melanin is the pigment that makes your skin darker. It acts like a natural sunblock. So you want more of that. We all make it, by the way. We all make melanin, but you're selected to make more of it in a place where the sunlight's intense. There's less selection to make less of it where sunlight's less intense, and you can use more of that sunlight to make vitamin D. Height, like I said before, in Kenya, for example, we see examples of local adaptation there. So there are some interesting stories. What I would say is humans love to tell adaptation stories. Everything's got an adaptation story, right? I mean, when I was growing up, my grandparents would tell me all kinds of crazy, those people look like that because of X, Y, and Z. It was always some story. Yeah. And it wasn't just sort of white, black, Asian. It was like the Irish people look like, it was a very hyper localized set of stories about these adaptation stories. Yeah. And, some of them were mean spirited. Some of them were not mean. They were just how my grandparents understood the world. It's how they were brought up. Almost all of those stories are totally bogus. Yeah. Actual adaptation to local situations is pretty rare.
Yeah. So what would you say is then the role that the environment plays in biological variation? Because, I mean, one thing that tends to bother me at least a bit is when, for example, the so-called hereditarians look at the average differences between human populations, and they immediately say or assume that they have to be genetic, or there have to be genes involved. And I'm not saying that there's no genes involved, but what is the role that the environment plays
Yeah.
there?
The environment for almost any trait is an enormous factor, right? Now, so there's a deep history there. That question, as you know, right? It swallows up a lot of history. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the world was hereditary. Everybody thought genes was everything, you know?
Yeah.
And so then if that's true, if the environment doesn't matter, what does that mean? That means that anything that I see about a population or a person that I don't like, I go, well, that's their genes, right? And so if that's the case, if that's their genes, well, then the best way to make a world that I want is to make sure those people with the bad genes don't have kids, right? And that goes to some really ugly places. That's the eugenics movement of the early 1900s. That goes direct line. You don't have to make up any stories. That is directly what is the Nazis used to develop the policies of the Holocaust. In the United States, that line of thinking where genes are everything and environment doesn't matter led to sterilizations and all sorts of terrible, terrible human tragedies here in the US. So the pushback against that was, hey, look, no, environment really matters. Environment has a huge fact. You know, the first kind of breakthrough was showing how important environment was for IQ, right? You know, people in the 1920s wanted to call all IQ variation genetic. 30s, 40s, 50s, we realized, no. Genetics plays a very tiny role in IQ, and it's a huge environmental story. How you're raised up, right? Our brains come into the world uncooked, and we cook them in those first few years. And the way they get cooked by the environment is almost the entire signal in IQ. Okay. Now you've got this interesting pushback, like you say, there's these hereditarians who want to say, no, the environmentalists have gotten it wrong. I can prove to you that there's IQ differences that's related to genetics. And if I can prove that there's genetic influence in IQ, then I win the argument. And we're back to the 1920s, and everything's genetic again. Or, you know, maybe they wouldn't go that far. Maybe they'd say, well, environment matters a little bit, but not really. You know, not enough to really shape the story. Okay, this is an interesting time to be doing this kind of science. We know now from really good genetic tests, genetic studies, that there is, I mean, I don't think this is a surprise to anybody really, but there's a genetic influence in IQ. It's small. But if I have a population of kids and I can give them the same, you know, I raise them the same way, so they're kind of, you know, from the same school, for example, same community. And I give them the same test. Some kids are going to do better than others. We know this. And we know that some piece of that seems to be due to their genetics, not just the way they are raised up. That's true for sure. And the influence of genetics on IQ, it's a bit of a slippery term, but we call it heritability, right? In how you inherit things, so it's a heritability.
Okay, so what does heritability mean exactly?
Yeah, heritability means how well, I mean, there are more than one, but there are mathematical formulas that calculate heritability. So in some very, very careful quantitative way, heritability is the answer to that equation. We can get into the equation if you want. But a better way to think about it, more useful, and all of the equations that do heritability get at the same issue is, if all I know is your genetics, how well can I predict your IQ in this case, or height? All right, I can do the heritability of anything. And so if all I know is your genetics, what gene variants you have, how good of a job do I do at predicting your IQ? And I could predict 0% of your IQ, so heritability could be 0. I can't predict it at all from your genetics. Or a heritability could be 100% or 1, right? Mathematically, 1 and 100% are the same thing. So I could go from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. 100% means if I know your genetics, I know your trait perfectly. Yeah? There are some traits like that. So my blood type, if I'm A, B, or O blood type,
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes, 100% heritable. If I know your genetics, I can do your blood test and I know they're going to match. Height is well, we'll get into twin studies versus modern genetic studies if we want, but we could say height's about 50 or 60% heritable, maybe up to 70 in some populations. In other words, I'll do better than guessing your height if I know your genetics, but I still won't probably get it exactly right for everybody. The modern approach to measuring IQ heritability says that heritability for those traits, for mental traits, not just IQ, but also things like your likelihood of depression, your personality type, those heritabilities in the modern approach of modern genetic science are about 10%, maybe up to 15% sometimes. You know, people are going to write in and say, no, I think it's higher. No, I think it's lower. But if you look across the data sets that we have available, I'm not too far off. It's around 10, 15%.
Okay.
That means that 90% of the variation I'm not catching with genetics, right? So that's the sort of scale of things here. So are the new hereditarians right that if I have a genetic component, then everything's genetics? No. Actually, what the new genetics says is most of it's not genetics. Now, here's the other little thing that they never talk about, that the hereditarians that as far as I'm concerned, I've never seen talk about seriously in the social media space or whatever. Those tests, a heritability test, only works within a population. I can only calculate it within a population.
Yeah.
It does not port. If I know that genetics accounts for about 10% of the variation within this group, and I can prove that, that doesn't mean that genetics accounts for 10% of the difference between this group and that group that I never measured, or even that I measured, but on a different day with a different setting. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. And so the gotcha, there's a genetic component to IQ, and that means that the difference between, for example, in the States, again, we're talking about like student performance with white students and black students, right? That's a big thing that comes up all the time.
Yes.
And people and the hereditarians will say, see, look, there's a difference here. Black students don't do as well. And we know from these careful studies within these populations that it's hereditary, that there's a genetic signal, and therefore those group differences are no. Actually, you can't do that. That is not what the test measures. It's a completely inappropriate use of that outcome. And so, yeah. On the other hand, you get people who are so afraid that there would be any genetic component to IQ at all. The serious environmentalists that don't want to believe there's any genetic influence, and those folks are around as well, that they push back so hard against the modern genetics work that you can't even have the conversation, because you have to be able to say, no, there is a genetic component. There's something, but it doesn't explain these differences. And so I took a long time to answer that question, but I think it deserves some nuance, because it is a multi-part sort of answer, right?
No, this is very interesting, and it's good that you explained all of those aspects, because I think it's important for people to get a full picture of this issue, because particularly on social media, the discussions are completely messy and all over the place, and people push for really extreme and sometimes dangerous views about population differences. So let me ask you now about another topic. So, and I want to ask you about this because many times people on the internet and elsewhere have discussions about what we as humans have evolved to digest. And then we hear terms like paleo diet or natural diet, or the kind of diet that our Homo sapiens ancestors had back in the savannah or someplace else. So, what have we really evolved to digest, and is a term like paleo diet scientific?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions. Well, I've had the great fortune in my career to be able to work with hunter-gatherers in northern Tanzania, to actually live with, the Hadza community there and do work with them. We work in northern Kenya now, so I've had the chance to be on the ground, living with folks who are living it. If anybody's living a paleo diet, right, it must be hunter-gatherers who are hunting wild foods, hunting wild game, and gathering wild plants. And what's immediately obvious to anybody who's ever had a chance to see these groups is it doesn't look like, the Twitter version of the paleo diet, right, at all. Lots of carbohydrates in the Hadza diet, including honey, which is just sugar. And it's not just this sort of meat-centered kind of thing that you often see talked about as a paleo diet. What's wonderful is if you go back to the ethnographies of a lot of these groups. So there's a history of people exploring the world, writing down what they see. This goes back to at least the 1600s or earlier. And so, you get these wonderful accounts of these early explorers talking about what people were eating, because of course, they noticed, and it's a human thing to think about food. And some of the stories are pretty boring, but a lot of them are like, will curl your hair, the kinds of things people will eat. People are eating rotten meat. They're eating bugs. They're eating maggots that are crawling out of the food. There's no cleanliness about how people are treating their food in the sense that we would think. And so that's the paleo diet. The paleo diet is whatever you can find. It can be really high in carb a lot of the time. And if you're going to go paleo meat, then, to be true to it, you'd have to eat lots of maggots, I think.
Okay, so and also, don't we have to consider the fact that particularly in human populations who have gone through agriculture, who have gone through societies where agriculture was practiced, we have specific adaptations to be able to digest things like cereal, vegetables, milk, eggs, beer, and so on.
Yeah. So there are some genetic variants that seem to they have become more common after agriculture, like you say. They help us digest some of those foods, some of those agricultural products, for sure. So, I think there's good evidence that we're adapted to those kinds of foods. I would point out that, one of the all meat and no grains school of thought in paleo world, they often focus on the Arctic populations, like, the classic Inuit populations living in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle, eating lots of meat. Yeah. That's true. If you live where there's no plants, guess what? You don't eat many plants. And humans are able to eat a whole wide variety of things. And so in those environments, yes, they eat a lot of meat. But guess what? Those environments are actually not even as old as farming. Farming is older than living in the Arctic. Farming is older than living with herds of cattle, actually. The plant agriculture predates animal agriculture by a couple thousand years. And so, people love to pick and choose the population that they like to support their diet. I would say the honest way to do it is to look at all these groups and realize, oh my gosh, you can eat almost anything and be a healthy human. It's a matter of, the proportions you eat. I think modern processed foods are a real problem, but the idea that we should only be eating meat or something like that is silly.
Okay, so let's tackle another controversial topic. Of course, nowadays with social media, I guess anything is controversial.
Yeah, so, right.
But let's talk about sexual development.
Okay, yeah.
How much variability is there in humans when it comes to sexual development?
Well, there's quite a bit. And so, the obvious variation is male versus female development, right? So if you think about embryological development and the way that you develop in the womb, in utero, there's sort of two tracks you can take. And, some species don't have sexes, right? There's just one monomorphic thing that just buds and just, that's how they propagate. But sexual reproduction, where you have a male and a female, you can call them whatever you want, but there's sort of two options, two approaches, two strategies. that has actually evolved several times in the history of life. And so, so humans as mammals follow the same kind of thing. You're either on one trajectory or another. If you have a Y chromosome that has this SRY gene, then you're going to develop in the male way, and your gonads develop as testes, and all the sexual anatomy that you develop is the male anatomy. If you don't have the SRY gene, there's no special gene that kicks off the female anatomy. That will happen in the absence of the SRY gene. So sort of, if you have SRY gene that's functional, there, okay, the male. Now, people listening, some are going, oh, of course, and some are going, no, you're not getting the variation right, because there's so many ways that can get varied and get tweaked, and that's true too. That's also true, that if I have an SRY gene, so I'd be XY chromosome. So you probably have heard, your listeners have heard of XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes. If you have a Y chromosome, the SRY gene is typically on that Y chromosome. If it's active, you start the male pathway embryologically, but there are lots of steps along the way. And so one of the things that happens initially is as the gonads develop into testes, they start making testosterone. Okay, but what if you can't, the cells that need to sort of hear that testosterone, right? Because hormones are a signal and a receiver. The receptors might be broken. And so you're producing testosterone normally, but the receptors don't function. In that case, what you'll end up with is essentially, I mean, there's variation in all these things, but it can happen that person will develop with female anatomy as far as anybody can tell. The gonads will be testes. They won't develop the full way, but they'll, from externally, that person will look female. Okay. On the other hand, you could have XX chromosomes, but you've had a translocated SRY gene. So genes, get reshuffled as you make sperm and egg cells. It's possible that the SRY gene, it is very rare, but it could get shuffled into a different chromosome. And so you get XX chromosome, you think, oh, well, that's a female. It's going to develop into the female anatomy. No, but the SRY gene is tagging along on some other chromosome and kicks off the male development that way. Even if an XX chromosome becomes a female. So it becomes a male. All right. There are a lot of different variations. They are those kind of anatomical developmental variations we call them, they used to be called, disorders, sexual developments. Now they're called differences in sexual development. Those sort of, consequential variations are pretty rare, right? There's been a lot of selection to get it right, because obviously we're all descended from sexually reproducing ancestors. And so there's been a lot of selection to get that, to kind of fine tune those things so you don't get this variation. But no biological system is perfect and is perfectly precise and accurate. And so you get this variation that happens. Okay, so what's the variation sexually? Well, the first big thing is male-female. We can talk about the variations across and the ambiguities there if you want.
But male, female, biologically, is it defined by the gametes that they produce, or is it any other criterion?
It's sort of the anatomical strategy. Okay. And the reason I'm going to say that is it's not just the gametes you produce, because I mean, if we go by the gametes you produce, and let me back up one more thing. There's only two pathways here. Sometimes they get muddled. So I'm not going to say that you can't sort of have, ambiguous anatomy and physiology. You can. But that's ambiguity between or among two pathways. There really are there's not a third pathway. There are two pathways. Okay. We have to think of them as processes. If you try to hang it on one trait, gamete production, okay, that seems like a pretty obvious one. How could you get that wrong? There are only eggs and sperm, by the way. So there you go. Fine. But the typical male development, when a boy is born, a male is born, they don't produce gametes. You don't produce gametes until puberty. So is that, organism that was born, that child, is that not a male until puberty? He's not producing gametes, huh? On the other side, if a woman grows up, has kids, typical female woman anatomy, the classic typical case, and then for some health reason or something like that, has her ovaries removed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she's not a female anymore? She doesn't have gametes. Or what about post-menopause when the ovaries shut down? Do you stop being a female? So to say like, oh, it has to be gametes. Okay, well, actually, you've just created more problems than you thought you were solving, because there are these weird complications, right? And so, again, this is a little bit like the IQ story. I find both extremes really frustrating, right? In the IQ story, we said, well, if you think it's all genetics, you're wrong. And if you think it's all environment, you're also wrong. I'm sorry. With sex, and then we'll talk about gender too, which is sort of a separate issue. If you say, well, there's, sex could be anything, and there's so many sexes or something like that, or it's not kind of a male and female process. Well, that's not really true. There's a male set of processes and a female set of processes. And yes, absolutely, those can get muddled, and there can be differences of sexual development. 100%. I agree. But those are variations that happen on two lines, and there really is just two lines. There's not a third.
Okay.
On the other hand, to say, aha, you agree there's only two, and that means that there's no, well, now, okay, no, you've gone too far that way too. We have to explain and understand it and also appreciate the variation as well. I don't know. Sorry, biology didn't develop to be easy.
Okay, but then let me ask you, because you're talking about two extremes.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's people who argue on biological grounds that sex is not binary? Do you think that they have a good enough scientific argument to make there?
I understand what they're arguing. What they're focusing on is the fact that you can have this kind of muddled development that ends up with differences of sexual development.
Yeah.
They're focusing on the fact that that there's really just a couple of genes that track you on the male pathway, and that most of the genes that a female or a male will develop from are shared, right? So there's a I mean, that's why, that's why so much is shared across male and female reproductive physiology. A lot of the hormone pathways are shared, et cetera. And they're focused on the fact that once we finally look at an adult and we look at things like height or like strength or like, and whatever your measure is, there's a lot of overlap. And so from that perspective, it doesn't look just like, you could make the argument, well, this is not just two things. So I understand the argument, and maybe I'm being a bit too simplistic with it, but I think that's the foundation of their argument. I don't think it's helpful, actually. I think it's more helpful and more based on the evidence to talk about, well, no, that there are two sexes, two processes of sexual development, a male and a female process. We have to be honest about differences in sexual development, that there are intersex individuals that develop. Yes, there are. And that's an important piece of the physiology, and let's understand that and not just ignore it. There are also, then we'll talk about gender too, I hope. And that's the way that people live their lives, isn't neatly defined by their anatomy. Like your mindset, Ricardo, if you were to give me your genes, I wouldn't know that you were going to become a podcast producer. How would I know that? And I don't know how you live your internal life, and if you feel like you're very male or whatever. I have no idea. I don't know how you live your life, and I would never know that from your genetics. And so we have to be honest about the complications too. But it doesn't help. My frustration is with people who often have this sort of progressive. Often the politics are very progressive, and what they want, I think, to hear them make the argument, is they want people to be respected and to be able to live their lives how they want. And I want that too. I hope we all do. But I think to kind of muddle the biology to get us there
Right.
is a little bit of a mistake.
But I mean, even if saying that sex is not a binary is not helpful, or
I
perhaps
don't
we
think
can,
it's helpful. No,
or
because I
even,
don't.
yeah, but even if it's not helpful, or even if we want to say that it's not true, some of the arguments, at least used by people who argue for a non-binary sex, are good scientific arguments that we have to take into
Yeah,
account.
I mean, I'm sure you could find lots of examples that wouldn't be good biology, but yeah, the people who
Yeah.
I hear arguing it, they're not wrong about their view of the biology, right?
Mhm.
There is intersection individuals that develop. There is this variation that happens in the system. There is a lot of shared anatomy and biology between male and female. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's sex, gender now. So,
Yeah.
what is the difference between sex and gender? And I'm very interested in hearing this from you, because since you're an evolutionary
Hmm.
anthropologist, I mean, people would tend to think about you as someone who is more interested in perhaps the more biological aspect of
Yeah.
things, and the cultural anthropologists would be more interested in
Yeah.
social constructs like gender and so on. So,
Yeah.
but what is your take on gender?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very real thing. The way that we organize our societies, we grow up, and the way we see the world, there's a gender component to it for sure, and that's across cultures. Everywhere I've ever lived or worked or traveled, right? There are masculine things and feminine things, and masculine people and feminine people, and women and men everywhere. You go to a Hadza camp, there's men and women. There's nobody, has so. That's a human universal. Now, what's interesting is, let's start with what people usually ignore, which is that this mindset that by the way, we don't really completely understand how the mind develops and becomes this mind from the neurons in your head, right? That's called the hard problem in psychology. And consciousness. Sorry, we don't really have a great explanation for it, but what we observe when we look around the world is that the consciousness that you and I and everybody shares, there's a component to it that's gendered, male and female. And what's remarkable is that 95% of the time plus, maybe 99% of the time, that mindset aligns with your biology, with your anatomy and physiology. Isn't that remarkable? That's crazy, right? That almost all the time, if I see a child born and I say, oh, that child is male anatomy, male physiology, typical development, I will be 99% right if I say, I bet he's gonna grow up and live his life as a man. That's remarkable. That's crazy. So, I mean, it's not crazy in the sense that this whole system evolves to support sexual reproduction. That's why it evolved. And you can only have sexual reproduction if you have males and females that want to interact and recreate and reproduce. So in that sense, it's not crazy. But just as a physiological observation, wow, that system is really, in tune, well calibrated.
Yeah.
It is also true, and this again, I'm sorry, but this is also true, that everywhere we've ever had big samples and big populations to look at, there have been people who don't align, right? Who have male anatomy and physiology, but go through life and really, their consciousness, their mindset, they feel like a woman. And there's some people who don't feel like either strongly, right? You get the spectrum. And it's not common, probabilistically, statistically, but it does happen everywhere we've ever had good data and big populations to look at. And so that seems to be part of the human developmental system as well. And that's interesting because humans are the only species that your mind has such a huge role in so many aspects of your life, right? Like your dog and cat and the birds outside, and they don't have these rich internal minds, as far as we know, that dictate everything about what they do, but we do. And so that becomes your gender is a part of that.
Mm.
And yeah, that's some fun and interesting things here. People would say, oh, it's completely divorced from your physiology.
Mm.
That the gender that you decide that you feel is you has nothing to do with your biology. That doesn't actually fit the data as far as I see it. First of all, there's this 99% matching issue, or 99% of the time it does. So that's a
Yes.
clue that there's some physiology there and how our minds create our genders. But there are also cases where, I mean, some of these are they're sort of sad to consider how this all happens. But cases where a male child is born and there's some either developmental issue or some kind of accident when they're very little, and their anatomy gets really hurt, so their penis gets hurt or something like that. And so there has been in the past an approach to say, okay, well, what we're going to do is remove that anatomy, do an operation to make the child externally look female, and raise that child as a girl.
Right.
It's not common, obviously, thank goodness. But when that's happened, a really large percentage of those girls, they're males, they're raised as girls, grow up to have, gender dysphoria. I think that would be the term, where they feel male. They feel like boys and men, and they have this anatomy that is female externally.
Yes.
And so that's a clue, I think, that actually, the biology does seem to shape the mind in ways that, that probably happen even before you're born and that last into your adulthood. There are cases that go the other way too. So the point being that this mindset that we have is not totally divorced from our biology. It just isn't. But we don't really understand entirely how it works either yet.
Okay, so with all of that in mind, how should we think about trans people? How do they fit into the picture of variability in terms of gender identity?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, anytime we've ever looked historically or today in populations we have big populations to see this, because it's not a huge percent of the population. They're a part of us. They're a part of the human experience. Is some people will have transgender identities. And I think, what I would like to see, I think what a lot of people like to see, is that people would be allowed to live how they feel and not, have to conform to some other person's view of how they ought to act and how they ought to believe they should live. And that's a legitimate, authentic way that we see humans developing around the world and through time.
Okay, so I have two more topics I wanted to ask you about, but actually I have a third one, because this is something that has also become relevant in the current American context.
Oh boy.
How do vaccines work, and why are they important?
Yeah. So vaccines are have to be just maybe the single greatest scientific breakthrough ever. I mean, it's kind of amazing what they do. Your immune system is a great example of an environmentally influenced piece of your physiology. It's not just humans. Any system with an immune system is trying to battle bacteria and viruses that replicate really fast and evolve really fast. And so you have to be born, if you have an immune system, you're born with a system that can adapt, because there's no way that your parents' generation is going to be ready. They're not going to give you genes that are going to be very helpful for the next generation of bacteria that are thousands of generations evolved from what your parents experienced, right? So your immune system has, it's like an army with multiple pieces and components, and they're all ready to go to battle with whatever they see and whatever's new. There's a component of your immune system that can remember when it gets hit with a particular bacteria or virus or pathogen. And that's really important, because maybe you'll get really sick this time and hopefully you survive it. But next time you won't get sick or as sick, because your immune system will remember, oh, we fought this one before. And if you've heard of antibodies, these are the antibodies kind of smother these viruses and flag them. I'm ready to make the right antibodies for that particular bacteria. It'll fit like a key in a lock to get that particular bacteria and take it out. So next time I don't get as sick.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's this memory, there's this learned component of your immune system, really a remarkable bit of evolution. And humans have it, lots of mammals have it generally. Anyway, we figured out, before we even really understood how immune systems work, this is hundreds of years ago, people figured out that if you get sick either with a weakened version of a particular disease or with a related disease that's like very similar but not exactly the same kind of a disease, that will train this learned immune system response in a way that when you get sick with a real thing, you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
That's great, because now I don't have to pass through this illness of being super sick and maybe dying or maybe being injured for life to get the immune memory. I can bypass that. And this was, the initial smallpox vaccines that you might have heard of. This is like, 1500s, 1600s. People in the Near East, people in North Africa, people in Asia figured this out. They would take the scabs. Some people would get sick and they develop these pustules or whatever. And you'd pick a little bit of the scab and you'd grind it up and you'd blow it up the nose of a kid or somebody who, and that would get them a little bit sick, and their immune system would learn to recognize that pathogen, and their learned immune system was ready for when they really got sick. All these cool ways of figuring out how to do this. Okay. George Washington insisted, for example, that his troops get the smallpox vaccine because it would allow them to not get smallpox when it passed through, and would keep them healthier as they're trying to battle the British. That's an important early story here in the U.S. For some, that has always been contentious. So, because people don't really understand how it works, I think, or they are misinformed about how it works, it's always been contentious. So back in the 1700s, when George Washington was making his troops get a smallpox vaccine, there were riots in Boston about getting the smallpox vaccine. People were trying to, push back even then. And then, smallpox would pass through Boston and kill a lot of people who didn't have vaccines, and people who were vaccinated were protected. So it's the story again and again and again. And we just saw it now with COVID. And now we're seeing it with this whole rethink about how vaccines work here in the US. And it's an age-old story. I know where the fear comes from. People are intentionally stoking these fears that vaccines are bad. And that's been something people have been stoking since at least the 1700s. There's a lot of fear about, anyway, you asked how vaccines work. That's how vaccines work. They train your learned immune system. We can talk about mRNA vaccines or something like that if you want, but that's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really frustrates me is that some of the claims made by, I think it's fair to call them anti-vaxxers, some of the claims made by them, like, for example, that vaccines cause autism or that mRNA vaccines are not safe. I mean, some of these things, even more so autism, because we have had more time to study that, I mean, have been thoroughly debunked, and people keep bringing it up as if it was still a valid scientific question. Right.
Yeah, I mean, you hear again and again, well, none of these vaccines have been tested.
Yeah,
that is simply not true. And so if you hear that claim, it's either by somebody who doesn't know the literature and know the decades of modern excellent science that have tested all these vaccines, or they're intentionally, misinforming you. So you have to decide if you're being intentionally misinformed or the person just doesn't know. But no, all these have been in writing this book, I thought, okay, well, let's be an open-minded person here and let's ask the question, the COVID vaccines, right? This is the COVID vaccine is the first time in history that this Nobel Prize winning technology was rolled out, this mRNA vaccine. mRNA vaccines, they put a little bit of mRNA into your body that makes a protein. So all of your DNA, the classic way DNA works is you have a gene, it makes an mRNA molecule, this long mRNA molecule that goes and acts as a template to make a protein, right? That's the classic central dogma of DNA. The mRNA system uses that, uses those mechanics and says, well, you don't have a gene that's going to make the right kind of protein that the bacteria makes or that virus makes. And so we're going to give you the mRNA molecule. It's going to float in there, act as a template to make a protein. And the protein it makes is a protein that the virus usually has on it. And so, great. So now you've had this protein floating around that looks like the virus. It's just the protein, though. It's not a full virus. It can't actually make you sick like a virus would.
Yeah.
And then your immune system can learn to recognize that. And now you have learned immunity. You have the vaccine response. It's very smart. I mean, so smart and so clever and effective, incredibly effective. But, it is a new technology. And so I thought, well, there's all these concerns and people are saying it leads to heart inflammation or, increased all-cause mortality. And so, look, I'm a scientist. I will be led by the evidence. And so, great. So I encourage anybody to go to PubMed or wherever you find your science and actually look at the actual articles that have tested this in tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people in the adult cases, tens of thousands of children. There's no elevated risk from that vaccine. And, they are incredibly safe and effective. And in any case, they're way safer, more effective. They're way safer than getting COVID, for sure. And so, I think we can have a discussion about, well, was the rollout done right? Was the discussion about what they were going to do? Because I think, maybe they were overpromised here in the States. People said, well, if you get the COVID vaccine, you'll never get COVID. That's not really what vaccines do. They don't stop you from getting the illness. They stop you from getting really sick from it. Right? They reduce your likelihood of dying or going to the hospital, in which COVID vaccines absolutely do. But you can still get the virus into you, right? The vaccine actually can't do anything until you have the virus on board. So, maybe there was problems with the rollout. Maybe there were problems with the politics of it. But it has become this flashpoint that it just didn't ever have to be.
Yeah. So let me just ask you about one last topic because I'm getting mindful of your time. So now there are a few people out there that are really worried about one day dying and they want to try to live forever. I mean, do you think that it would ever be possible to live forever? I mean, why do we have biological limits on our life expectancy?
Yeah, because so that first part's the easiest answer, I think, is the reason that all organisms have a lifespan and die is that energy and time are limited. That's how all species have evolved, in a time and energy limited space. That's the world that we live in. And so resources are limited. You can spend them on reproduction or you can spend them on survival. You kind of can't spend them on both because those processes physiologically are just different processes. You got to pick.
Yeah.
And so every organism has this balance. I'm going to spend some on reproduction, some on survival. A really long-lived species, well, what that tells you is they're spending a lot of their resources on survival, and there's probably some reduction in how much they can spend on reproduction. So they can't spend so much on reproduction. Whereas an animal that sort of, a mouse, for example, you can do whatever you want with a mouse, treat it as well as you can, give it the best veterinary care. It still is going to die after a year. I don't know how long they live, a few years at most. But they reproduce a lot, right? Lots of mouse pups. And so that's all reproduction, no survival versus all survival, no reproduction. You'll never have all survival, no reproduction. That can't evolve because evolution favors reproductive success, right? Yes. So if you never reproduce, you're a dead end evolutionarily. So we're all kind of built with an expiration date, right? We all will be done whenever evolution has, the hand we've been dealt from evolution is to be done at some point. And that reflects the trade-offs that our bodies make that we can't control. into how much we're going to spend on maintenance versus reproduction. So that's the easy answer there. Are we ever going to live forever? Well, there are animals that live a long, long time compared to us. Whales can live a couple hundred years, it sounds like. Some sharks can live like 600 years at least. Yeah. So we could live a lot longer, but that would require like a wholesale change in our genetics, right? So just like there are animals that live twice as long. Okay, could we do that? Well, I don't know. That's the same as asking, could we engineer ourselves to grow twice as tall?
Right.
Right. I mean, maybe. I don't know. To say never it seems. Look, science develops at a really breakneck pace. I mean, maybe, but it would require an incredible rewrite of our genetics, not just some supplements and getting to bed at 8 o'clock. It's going to be more than that. And so the folks who want to live forever, man, good luck. I hope so. I wish you the best. And I hope that along the way, they discover some cool science that we can all share, and not just the billionaires. But I'm skeptical. I think, again, it would be the same. It's the same as asking, can we grow twice as tall? And the answer is, it's probably not going to happen with supplements and a workout routine and making sure you get to bed and don't eat too much. I mean, that ain't going to grow you twice as tall either. It's probably not going to get you to live twice as long.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, it would be great if we could double our lifespan. Let's say, okay, so now we could live up till 240 years old, 250. But that's one thing. But to live forever, I mean, that's a completely different ballgame, right?
Yeah, forever is a long time. And forever sounds pretty impossible.
Yeah. Okay, so let's leave it there, Dr. Pontzer. And the book is again Adaptable: How Your Unique Body Really Works and Why Our Biology Unites Us. I'm leaving a link to it in the description. And would you like just to tell people where they can find you on the internet?
Sure. The social media sphere, I'm just Herman Pontzer. You can find me pretty easily. And you can check out the lab website if you want to see what we're up to these days. And otherwise, look for me on amazing discussions like this.
Okay, so thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.